Of course, ethics is not just one topic, and the philosophy of ethics is not just one topic. And perhaps it's best if we divide it into three different areas. So one area that philosophers are interested in is the status of ethical statements. So are they objective? If I say it's wrong to murder, is that an objective statement? Is it a subjective statement? And if it's subjective, what does that mean? Is it just a matter of opinion? Is it just my opinion? And if somebody else disagrees with me, that's just a difference of opinion, and there's no fact of the matter to ascertain who's right and who's wrong. And this is probably the toughest part of the philosophy of ethics, and people disagree about its status and how to try and ground ethics in some kind of objectivity. Clearly, ethical statements are not like statements about the physical world. If I say that chair over there has got four legs and is red, well, if I say that chair over there has got four legs and a back to it, so those are all the things about that chair that one can test, and one can go into a laboratory and one can measure the legs, and one can see that it has a back to it, and one can imagine, of course, if one leaves this room, that chair will still be there, and it's not dependent upon human beings for its existence. But morality is dependent on human beings. There's no sense that there could be morality if there were no human beings, or at least sentient creatures. We could make no sense of morality without any humans on the planet. There's no morality on the moon or on planet Mars because there are no sentient creatures there. So we need human beings to have morality. So that's clearly a difference there between morals and the kind of physical world. And one question is, well, how do we make sense then of morality being objective? If you ask students this, often their first reaction is to say, oh, morality is just a matter of opinion, it's just my opinion. But actually, most people don't believe that. And if you then listen to them during the course of the day, they'll get involved in a heated debate about morality. And it makes no sense to have a heated debate about morality unless you take it seriously, unless you think that you're right and somebody else is wrong, whether it's about politics or all sorts of topics. People actually believe that there is a right answer and that somebody else who disagrees with them is wrong in some kind of important sense, and it's not just an opinion. So how do you make sense of it? I mean, I quite like the analogy with colour in a way, in that this table in front of us is black, and if somebody says this table is pink, well, they're just wrong, they're making a mistake, they're colourblind or something like that. But if human beings disappear from this room and from this planet, it makes no sense to talk about redness where there are no sentient creatures here. You need people to be able to see something black. Without human beings, there's no such thing as colour. And I think there's probably an analogy there with morality. So without human beings, you can make no sense of morality, but you can still make mistakes about morality. I can make a mistake about the colour of that table. In any case, that's one big area, the status of morality and whether it's objective, whether it's subjective, and what those terms mean. That's one category of moral philosophy. Another big area of moral philosophy is how we should live. And there it makes sense traditionally to divide ethics into three areas. And there are three different broad approaches. Some people think that the boundaries are not as strict as other people, but traditionally how we should live has been, and how we should act has been divided into three different areas. There's a tradition going back all the way to Aristotle, now 2,500 years, which is that what's important is character. And one should act in the way that a good person would act. One should be generous in the way a generous person would act. One should exhibit the virtues of a virtuous person. And morality is to be understood in terms of character. There's another approach which has its roots in Kant, the 18th century, and Immanuel Kant, who was born in Königsberg. And Kant believed that we should act according to a certain set of moral rules, and that we shouldn't transgress those rules, and we should act in accordance with how everybody else would act. It's often been compared to the golden rule, and some elements of Christianity have things in common with Immanuel Kant. And I guess there are examples like lying or promise keeping. You shouldn't lie because you should act in a way that everybody else should act, and you can't possibly wish that everybody lies. You should keep your promises and so on. And I guess the tradition of human rights that we have in the world at the moment owes a lot to Immanuel Kant and to what's called deontological ethics, that they are understood by a set of norms that shouldn't be transgressed. Torture is an example. You shouldn't torture people, no matter what the consequences are. And all sorts of other human rights are grounded in Immanuel Kant's philosophy, really. And I think we probably have Immanuel Kant, nobody realises this, but probably we have Immanuel Kant to thank for our modern conception of human rights. And then we jump forward another century or so to John Stuart Mill and to Jeremy Bentham. And these were British utilitarians. And John Stuart Mill believed that we should act according to what the best consequences were. Jeremy Bentham had a slightly cruder version of that. We should act according to that which maximises happiness. And you can see the tension there between Mill and Immanuel Kant. So where Kant said you shouldn't ever torture people, or you shouldn't lie, or you should always keep your promises, John Stuart Mill thought, well, if that produced the best consequences, then that was the right thing to do. So that sometimes it's the right thing to do to lie. Sometimes it's the right thing to do to fail to keep your promise. Sometimes, if necessary, it might be the right thing to do to torture somebody if there's a bomb about to be detonated and it's the only way you can find out where the bomb is, and there might be thousands of lives at stake. So those traditions are in conflict. They give different answers, really, about how we should act in certain circumstances. There are ways of trying to make them coincide. I think that most of us probably have strongly Kantian deontological instincts rather than utilitarian instincts, so that we, on the whole, don't think that consequences are all that matters. But often we take a quite more tolerant view about governments, for example, so that where individuals are interacting, we have quite Kantian attitudes, and we think that it's appalling if individuals treat each other in a non-deontological viewpoint. But when it comes to government, we think, well, maybe the government knows best. We're slightly more magnanimous and generous-spirited when it comes to the government, and we think, well, maybe the government might need to have to lie every now and again for the greater good, and the government has all our interests in common. So that's an intuition that some people share. Anyway, that's the second big category. So I've talked about meta-ethics, and I've talked about these different approaches about how to live. And then there's another part of ethics which is very practical, which doesn't look at the principles by which we live our lives. It draws on Kant, and it draws on Aristotle, and it draws on John Stuart Mill, but it looks very particularly at issues that cause us to disagree in contemporary life. And so it might, for example, look at debates about abortion. It might address issues about capital punishment, euthanasia, all sorts of areas of our moral world that people disagree about. And philosophers have had a lot to say about all those areas. Charity is another example, who we should give to and how much we should give to. Again, it draws on those traditions that I was talking about. So a utilitarian, for example, would say that we are as much responsible for what we fail to do as for what we actually do. And one of the implications of that is that if we fail to give to people who are, for example, dying in the third world, we are just as responsible for that as if we actually send them poison. All that matters is the consequences. So we can draw no distinction between acting and failing to act. For myself, I'm particularly interested in dilemmas that are thrown up by advances in science. And I think these are particularly interesting because our intuitions often lag behind. So something will happen and science will invent something, and often we don't know how to respond to it. Or maybe our first response is a response of repugnance, disgust, and it takes us some time to get used to it. An example of that might be, for example, in vitro fertilization, which has been around for I don't know how long, but 15, 20 years now. And when it was first introduced, there were lots of voices saying how appalling, how disgusting, how unnatural it is that a baby could be created, as it were, outside the womb and then implanted in the womb. And now, at least in Britain, nobody thinks it's disgusting or repugnant, or very few people do. And it's just an accepted part of medical practice, and people are getting married later, having children later, and in vitro fertilization has been extremely important. Many of my friends have had children through in vitro fertilization, and nobody is, as I say, appalled or thinks that somehow they've acted immorally. But it took a long time for our intuitions to come to terms with that. And I think one of the ways in which philosophy can help, and moral philosophy can help, is to shortcut that process and to help people think about these new developments and to wonder whether they are things we should object to or not. And sometimes they might be things we should object to. Sometimes there might be developments in science. There may be developments of some kind of weapons that we think are abhorrent and should be stopped or controlled. And then other times we might think, well, even if your initial reaction is disgust, actually if you think about it a bit more carefully, well, who is harmed? Does it lead to a more inegalitarian society? If nobody's harmed, if it doesn't lead to a more inegalitarian society, well, what could be the objection to it? And let's try and pinpoint why it might be wrong. And we might not find nothing to object to, and we might think that despite our instinctive initial response to it and objection to it, in fact this is something that we should be neutral about, or indeed that we should embrace. So I think that's another area that philosophers can in fact be quite useful.
So the scale of human cooperation is really quite puzzling from a biological point of view. I mean, when we look elsewhere in the natural world, when we look at ants or amoebas or meerkats or baboons or chimpanzees, what we find is that cooperation tends to be restricted to relatively small groups. Those groups are formed of genetic relatives, and in some sense they help each other because they're genetic relatives. because they share genes, that shared genetic interest in the future is what leads natural selection to favour helping behaviour within these groups. And we see this pattern right across the natural world until we get to humans. Humans don't just cooperate in small groups formed of close relatives and then behave aggressively with hostility to individuals in other groups. Instead, we find very, very large-scale societies. This isn't even a recent phenomenon, that it really seems to, even in human prehistory, before nation-states as we know it, before governments, before societies of millions of people, there were still tribal groups. Tribal groups of maybe 500 to 1,000 individuals. And they weren't composed of close genetic relatives. This was about cooperation on a very large scale, involving individuals who would have barely known each other, who would have been essentially strangers to each other, nevertheless acting cooperatively, helping each other, at the very least interacting non-aggressively when they met and recognized each other as members of the same tribe. And this really bucks the trend across the rest of the natural world and leaves evolutionary theorists scratching their heads for an explanation. What is it that explains cooperation in large groups of genetic non-relatives? It's not kin selection as we know it in the ordinary sense. So what is it? My strong suspicion, and a suspicion that I share with a lot of evolutionary anthropologists working in this area, is that the key to understanding human cooperation is cultural evolution. Not genetic evolution, but cultural evolution. Where cultural evolution is like genetic evolution, in that you have processes a bit like natural selection, processes that are a bit Darwinian at work, favouring some variants over others. But the units here are not genes. It's not genes that are being selected. It's beliefs, values, skills, representations in people's heads, what are often called cultural variants. They don't have to be memes. The concept of a meme from Richard Dawkins is a famous way of understanding cultural evolution, on which the units of cultural transmission and learning are taken to be very much like genes, and that they're taken to be little particles that are transmitted by themselves with high fidelity. It doesn't have to work exactly like that. We can be talking here about beliefs, values, skills that kind of blend when you learn from many, many individuals. What you inherit is a kind of blend of their beliefs, values, and skills, not just a meme, But the thought is that even if cultural inheritance is a bit of a mess in that sense, it's kind of blending inheritance rather than all about memes, there can still be interesting analogies to be drawn between processes of cultural change and processes of genetic evolution, and that these processes of cultural evolution are what lead to a kind of altruism in humans that we just don't see in chimpanzees, our closest living relatives. Chimpanzees live in small groups. In general, when they encounter individuals from other groups, those interactions are very, very hostile. They'll quite happily, given the chance, kill a chimpanzee from a rival group who strays into their territory. This is why chimpanzees don't really have tribes to speak of. They don't cooperate with non-relatives in the right kind of way. So how do we go about building a theory of cultural evolution that will help us explain human altruism? What should the core principles of that theory be? Well, I think a very good place to look is actually the theory of kin selection or inclusive fitness. What is really, I think, our best current theory of how altruism evolves by genetic evolution. I think we should be looking at that theory and trying to think of ways in which we can take the core principles of that theory and apply them to the cultural case. Now, the core principle of the theory of kin selection is a principle known as Hamilton's rule. This principle that says altruistic behaviors are favored by natural selection when RB is greater than C, where C is the cost to the individual who performs the altruistic behavior, measured in the currency of reproductive success. B is the benefit that that organism confers on another one by virtue of its altruistic behavior. And R is what's known as the coefficient of relatedness, a measure of the genetic resemblance between the two organisms involved. So if you think of ants, the idea is that the workers help the queen because R is positive, the workers are related to the queen, and RB outweighs C. The cost the ants incur by helping the queen is outweighed by the benefit times R that they confer on the queen. And I think we should be looking for ways to transpose that insight across to the case of human cultural evolution. Now that means we have to think about the key terms quite differently. It means that instead of thinking about a coefficient of genetic relatedness, we need to be thinking about a coefficient of cultural relatedness, where cultural relatedness is not about the genetic similarity between you and the person you're helping, but rather about the cultural similarity, your tendency to share beliefs, values, skills with that potential beneficiary. The basic idea is the same, that you have an incentive to help those individuals who share the transmissible basis of the behavior you're performing. All we're doing is saying that instead of the behavior being based in genes, the behavior is based in beliefs, values, skills, and so on. Now that's a kind of basic idea. It leaves a lot of questions unanswered. It leaves a lot of complications about how we flesh out the details, about how to apply Hamilton's insights from the genetic case in the cultural case. Now, I don't have time to go into all of those details here. I'll just say that I think this is an area in which anthropologists can actually learn quite a lot from microbiologists. People studying humans can learn quite a lot from people studying bacteria. And the reason for this is that despite all of the obvious differences between humans and bacteria, we don't split in half every 20 minutes. They don't have institutions, religions, states, and so on. In spite of all of that, there's a very important similarity. And that similarity is horizontal transmission. What I mean by that is that bacteria trade genes with each other. When they meet in natural populations, sometimes they touch, they conjugate, and little packets of DNA, called plasmids, can move from one bacterium to another. So genetic material starts off in one bacterium, ends up in another, replicates through cell-to-cell contact. And so these bacteria end up sharing genes with each other that they didn't share before. And so we have here a conception of how it can be that two organisms can come to resemble each other genetically, not because they're actually close relatives, but because they've engaged in a process, a contact process, that led to horizontal transmission of genes from one to the other. And this, I think, resembles in interesting ways the process of social learning, where humans don't simply have the beliefs, values, skills they got off their parents, but actually meet with each other in social situations and learn from each other socially. Now, these processes, of course, are very different, but there is a sense in which humans, after hundreds of millions of years of evolution in between, have rediscovered horizontal transmission. We've rediscovered a way of transmitting to each other, not through the parent-offspring channel, but through other channels. And what I think is that we can gain some insight into how social learning affects the dynamics of cultural evolution in humans by looking at how horizontal transmission affects the dynamics of genetic evolution in bacteria. So this is why for all the differences, I think anthropologists and microbiologists should be working closely together to develop a deeper understanding of how it is that horizontal transmission fundamentally changes the dynamics of evolution and creates new ways for altruism between genetic non-relatives to evolve.
Ordinarily, we presuppose in daily life that we're morally responsible for our actions in the following sense, that when people perform actions that are bad, they deserve to be blamed for them. And when people perform actions that are good, they deserve to be praised for them. And if they're especially bad, we believe that people deserve to be punished for their actions. But there are certain traditional threats to this position that stem from metaphysical views about the world. So, for example, already thousands of years ago, people thought, there might be a God, and maybe God determines everything that happens. Maybe the divine will from all of eternity determines everything that occurs. And if God determines all of our actions, do we really deserve to be blamed for the bad ones? And do we deserve to be blamed for the good ones? Nowadays, people typically don't frame the problem for moral responsibility in terms of God's actions or God's determining will, but rather in terms of natural determinism. So the worry is that maybe the world is such that any particular state of the world, in accordance with the laws of nature, determines any subsequent state of the world. So that all of our actions are causally determined in virtue of states of the world before we were born in accordance with the natural laws. That's been taken to be a threat to our ordinary presupposition that we deserve blame for the bad actions we perform, we deserve praise for the good actions we perform. Okay? So typically we think that we require a certain kind of control in action for moral responsibility of that sort. And that kind of control in action we call free will in the free will debate. So the question really is free will, the free will required for moral responsibility in the sense that I just specified, is that compatible with causal determination? Either causal determination by the laws of nature or causal determination by the will of God. Now, philosophers over the centuries have staked out a number of different positions on this issue. So there are compatibilists, people that think that moral responsibility and the free will required for moral responsibility is in fact compatible with causal determination. Okay, those are called compatibilists. And a lot of famous philosophers like Leibniz and David Hume were compatibilists. Other people are incompatibilists. They say there's no way that if we're causally determined to act as we do, that we ever deserve to be blamed for the bad actions we perform. They're called incompatibilists. And in turn, the incompatibilists divide into two camps. Some incompatibilists think that determinism is false. Right? It's like Berkeley, for example, and Kant at least believed, Immanuel Kant, that determinism is false, and hence that at least we can believe that we have a sort of free will which is incompatible with causal determination. Right? Now, the final position is this, that causal determination is incompatible with free will, but causal determination is in fact true, so we don't have free will. And the famous person in the history of philosophy who believed that was Spinoza in the 17th century. And that's the position that I argue for, right, in the free will debate. So I want to argue with Spinoza that the way the world is, now I'm not sure, with Spinoza was sure that the world is causally deterministic. I think that problems for free will also arise if the world is not causally deterministic, for reasons that Hume pointed out. Because after all, if our actions are random or chance, and it doesn't seem as if we have the sort of control required for moral responsibility either. Right? Okay, so what I want to argue is that Spinoza was right, that the way nature is makes it the case that we lack the sort of control required for moral responsibility. Now, in a particular sense, the kind of responsibility that I specified was this, that we deserve to be blamed for the bad actions we perform, and we deserve to be praised for the good actions we perform. But look, I mean, even if causal determination is true, on my view, we still have a certain kind of control in action, because we can still cause actions in accordance with our perception of the good reasons for acting. Right? It's a possibility. So even if it's the case that we never deserve to be blamed or deserve to be praised, perhaps there are other aspects of our practice of holding people morally responsible that can be saved, and I argue for that claim as well. For example, when we blame our children for performing bad actions, is it because we believe that the children deserve to be blamed for the bad actions they perform? Or when we punish them, is it because we believe that the children deserve to be punished for the bad actions they perform? Or is it that we want to educate the children morally? Right? And I suggest that we're in the practice of holding our children morally responsible. For the most part, when we blame children, we're not interested in giving the children what they deserve, but rather forming them morally, changing their moral dispositions so that they're better beings. And I think that even if causal determination is true, we still have the sort of control in action that's required for this part of our practice of holding morally responsible. Okay? So in the end, what I want to say is that as far as the traditional free will debate is concerned, we have no free will because we don't have the sort of control in action required for deserved praise and blame. But we do have the sort of control in action required for the kind of blame that's forward-looking, that aims at making people better. Right? And that's the kind of moral responsibility that's especially important, I think, in the raising of children, or when teachers blame their students, for example, and maybe even in personal relationships. When we blame each other in personal relationships, maybe we're much more interested in forming people morally than we are in giving people what they deserve. So in the end, I think that even if we don't have free will, in the traditional sense of the kind of control required for deserved praise and blame, we have enough control in action to save at least a very important part of our practice of holding morally responsible. And that's roughly the position of Spinoza and the one I argue for and endorse. So you might want to know why philosophers nowadays are so interested in the problem of free will. And I think it has to do with the fact that whether or not we have free will has certain important practical implications. It has practical implications for how we treat each other. Do we treat each other as if we deserve to be blamed or deserve to be punished for the bad actions that we perform? Or do we treat people in a different sort of way, in a way that's solely forward-looking, in a way that aims at character formation, making people better than they are? It also has a very important implication for how we treat criminals. So maybe this isn't true all over the world, but in the United States, for example, criminals are treated as if they deserve to be punished. Right? And often the justification, at least part of the justification for treating criminals harshly or badly, is that they deserve this by virtue of having acted in the way that they did. Now, if criminals don't have the sort of free will required for deserved punishment or deserved blame, then we have to think of a different way of treating criminals. And so one proposal is this, that because criminals are deterministic beings, their actions are determined by factors beyond our control, we should have a certain kind of sympathy with them. And we have to protect ourselves against really dangerous criminals. So perhaps in the case of especially violent criminals, we want to protect society from them by incarcerating them or by detaining them. But another very important aspect of criminal policy, if we don't have free will in the sense that I specified, is rehabilitation, that we're very interested in rehabilitating criminals, making them better beings. Okay? So I think that free will is really interesting because whether or not we have free will has some very important practical implications, both for our personal relationships and for societal policy with respect to how criminals are treated. I think another reason that philosophers today are interested in the free will problem is that there are very interesting results coming out in neuroscience. So it does seem as if much of our behavior is caused by unconscious factors. Okay? So one picture of the mind that comes from Descartes is that the mind is wholly conscious and that whatever mental states are involved in the causation of action are conscious and available to conscious reflection. But that picture seems to be false. It seems to be the case that much of what controls action is unconscious. Now, if much of what controls action is in fact unconscious, then is it reasonable to believe that we have free will in the traditional sense? Or should we be more skeptical about the idea that we have free will in this sense? So I think that because of its practical implications and because of certain kind of concerns that are raised by contemporary neuroscience about conscious control of action, philosophers are especially interested in the free will problem today. Okay, so what are the most important recent works on the free will problem? Well, I mentioned a number of different views. One is compatibilism. There are many compatibilists nowadays. John Fisher has written some of the most important compatibilist books, and his view in general is that as long as we're rational or responsive to reasons, then we'll have the sort of free will required for deserved praise and blame. Another person who's worked on this is Dana Nelkin. Now, she believes that, along with Susan Wolf, was an important work on this as well, that free will isn't required for praise, but free will is required for blame. Okay? So that's an asymmetrical view. On the libertarian side, on the side of those who are incompatibilists but believe that determinism is false and we have free will, there's Robert Kane, has a book called The Significance of Free Will, which is a defense of a scientifically sound version of that particular sort of view. Okay? And then there are free will skeptics. Now, I'm a free will skeptic, but another pioneer free will skeptic is Galen Strawson. Okay? So he has a book from 1986 called Freedom and Belief, where he argues for the anti-free will view. And then in neuroscience, there are important studies done by Benjamin Libet, okay? And he's got a book from 2004 in which he describes his neuroscientific experiments that, in his view, indicate that we don't have free will. And another important work from the point of view of neuroscience and psychology is written by Daniel Wegner. Okay? So he has a book from 2002. He's a Harvard professor, in which he argues that psychological and neuroscientific studies indicate that we don't have free will.
Okay, imagine this. You're on a trolley. It's a train. It's rolling down the track. And you can see, as you're looking ahead, that it is on course to run over 5 people who are in the way, and you can't get them out of the way, so your trolley is going to run over them and kill them. So, but you do have one thing that you could do. You can hit a switch that will divert the trolley onto a side track. So, you look down the side track just as you're about to hit the switch, and you realize there is one person on the side track. So if you divert the trolley onto the side track, you are going to kill that one person. So this is, for the last 30 to 40 years, this has been a fundamental puzzle that philosophers have thought about a lot. Do you get to change the course of the trolley? Do you get to move the trolley onto another track? And it appears, one way of describing it anyway, is you will be saving 5 lives and you will be deliberately killing one person. Do you get to kill one person in order to save 5 lives? Now, here's one thing that you want to say. You want to say, but there's something else you can do. You can yell at the people, and there's something. You have other options. And so, but that is irritating to a philosophy professor, because what you want to say is, can we just stay on topic here? Because the point is it okay to kill one person in order to save 5 persons? Don't say, well, maybe I can derail it without killing it. It's 1 versus 5. Just work with me with the logic of the case, because we're trying to get at a fundamental truth about ethics. Now, I was in Kazakhstan, and I was giving a course on the nature of justice to a class consisted of 21 professors, the professors all coming from post-Soviet republics. And so I was talking to them about justice, going over a manuscript of a book I was working on at the time. So I presented to them the trolley problem. And I said, okay, so what are you going to do? And they said, like all of my classes of undergraduate students say, well, there's something else you can do. And I said, what I always say is, just work with me on this. It's 1 and 5. It's not that complicated. Don't start thinking about, well, maybe if I had a hot air balloon or something. It's just go with me, 1 and 5. Which is it? And they called a timeout, as I had invited them to do. I said, if you need help with a translation or something, you want to talk to each other, just call a timeout anytime. And they called a timeout, and they talked to themselves. And then one of them turned to me, he was a Russian incidentally, and he said, oh yes, this is very interesting. We've actually heard this story before. In fact, we've heard it all our lives. All our lives we've been told that the few have to be sacrificed for the sake of the many. And it was a lie. There was always another way. And so I think of that as the most important thing I ever learned in an ethics class, and it was taught to me by a Russian student. And so what is the lesson that student was teaching me there, which is, it's something like, justice is about respecting the value of people. It's about respecting the separateness of people. It's about realizing that people aren't just 1s and 5s to be traded off, to be sacrificed for the sake of the many. That when the question of justice comes up and it's time to sacrifice the few for the sake of the many, that's exactly what justice is. It is about finding another way. Now let me compare trolley to a different kind of case. This case is called hospital. So imagine that you were a surgeon. You're not on a trolley, you're in a surgical unit. You're a surgeon and you have 5 patients. They're all dying because you don't have suitable organ transplant donors available. And then a delivery person walks in with a package. And you look at the person and you can see from the person's scan or something like that, you know you've treated that person as a patient, but somehow you know that person has compatible blood work with all of these other 5 patients. This one person is a suitable donor for all of those 5 patients. You can save those 5 patients by removing that one person's organs. So if we assume there is no, you want to say, oh, but there's other complications. And in philosophy we say, can we just forget about the other complications? There's no chance that the one person who donates the 5 organs, he has no chance of survival, and you certainly will be able to save the other 5. There's no risk of infection or anything like that. Nothing can go wrong. You can save those 5 patients by sacrificing the one healthy patient. So there you have the question. The question is, do you get to promote value in those 5 people at the expense of value in that one person? That's the fundamental question. It's the same question as the question of trolley. And yet people don't hear that question the same way. Most people will say in response to the trolley question, well, yes, you look at the numbers and it's terrible to have to sacrifice the one person, but you do it in order to save the 5. But then when we talk about hospital, and can the surgeon sacrifice the one to save the 5? And almost everybody in that case answers no. And so then I say, why is there a difference? It's 5, it's 1. Those are the 2 important. There are only 2 important numbers, and that's what they are. There are only 2 questions of value at stake. 5 lives and 1 life. And so how would you come up with different answers in the 2 cases? Why would you come up with different answers? Here's why the answers are different. This is my theory anyway. When we look at the hospital setting, we understand that we're talking about a community and an institution and a society. In the trolley problem, that is, a science fiction case, and we are not thinking about it against the background of a community. When we're thinking about a hospital, we are thinking of a hospital as an institution that has a certain function in a community. The hospital is the promoter of value, and the surgeon is the promoter of value within that institution. So how do real-world surgeons promote value? Well, part of the answer is they promote value by respecting it. Or you say the hospital promotes value by respecting it. So institutions that actually work are institutions that enable people to trust each other. people have to trust society to treat them as possessors of rights. That's one thing. And the second thing is society itself, the institutions of a society have to trust people to make use of the opportunities that they have as possessors of rights. There are no guarantees, but that's just something that a society has to accept. The institutions that actually work are not the ones that are guaranteeing everything. The institutions that actually work are the institutions that give people a chance to stand or fall by their own merit. That sounds frightening. It is frightening. But the fact is, the societies that actually work are based on that principle. Sometimes treating values with respect is the best we can do. We can't do any better than that. Sometimes all that a government needs to do to promote value is simply to be involved in respecting it. It leaves the promoting to something else. So if you say something needs doing, people need lots of things. People need an education, people need a lot of things, but they don't need a lot from government. So if you say, what do they need from a plumber? They need about one thing. What do people need from a carpenter? They need about one thing. What do people need from a government? They need roughly one thing. They don't need, just because something is worth doing doesn't mean the plumber should do it. Just because something is worth doing doesn't mean the carpenter should do it. And just because something is worth doing doesn't mean that the government should do it. It's a society prospers, it becomes wealthy, it becomes healthy, it becomes moral when people recognize their own roles in promoting the good, which often is just a matter of respecting it. I talked earlier as if there's a fundamental decision about whether to respect value or promote it. In an institutional context, that's a false dichotomy, because in an institutional context, you see that the way in which institutions promote value is by putting people in a position where they can afford to trust each other, which means you put people in a position where they feel respected. So if you imagine a hospital where surgeons sacrifice a healthy person every time they need the person's organs to save 5 people, well, there's not going to be any delivery people at that hospital anymore. The hospital is going to break down. People won't go near that place. And it's because that place, because it is willing to sacrifice one person to save 5, that's an institution that can't be trusted. So institutions serve the good, they promote the good by enabling people to trust each other. That's the fundamental lesson of hospital. The fundamental lesson is this: moral institutions, they get the right result not by aiming at the right result, but by treating people with respect. Moral institutions don't try to take over the job of promoting the good. Moral institutions provide a background framework in which the good is respected, because that's the framework within which surgeons and patients, all of the people who live in the institution, who work together, who cooperate within the framework of the institution, they're the ones that do the promoting. And the institution does its job as part of the promotion process by making people, putting people in a situation where they can afford to trust each other. So the institution has to establish the respect. If it tries to take over the job of promoting, then it's a society that's falling apart. If you think about legal institutions in general, you might say, what would you want from your society in the realm of violent crime? You might say, here's an obvious thing, that the law should function in such a way as to minimize the number of murders. You'd say, does that make sense? And the answer is yes, of course it does. Now, how exactly does the law go about minimizing the number of murders? And you might say, well, here's a proposal, here's a suggestion. You pass a law that says everyone is required to minimize the number of murders. Now, you might say, as a proposal for minimizing the number of murders, a law that says minimize the number of murders. That's not going to work. That's not how the law does it. That's not the law's job. That's not the government's job. It's not the police force's job. The way that this background system of law and order minimizes the number of murders is simply by making murder illegal. That's all. So this works in an overall sense to be part of a society that promotes the value of life being sacred, of life being safe. The background framework doesn't take over all of the essentials of that job. The background framework just makes murder illegal. It just says you people have to show each other basic respect. And within that framework, then the surgeons take off from there. The surgeons can go ahead and save as many lives as they can, but not if it involves committing murder.
A question that has long puzzled philosophers and scientists and just about everybody is where moral values come from. And recently, developments in neuroscience, I think, have given us some very important ideas about the basis for that. So we know, of course, that all nervous systems must be organized in such a way as to see to their own survival. They must be organized so that they seek food and water and mates, so that they avoid threats, so that they feel fear at the right time and run away or stay and fight and so forth. But they are all organized to see to their own self-interest, to their own care. And we understand why this would have happened, because in the evolution of organisms, any organism that lacks the circuitry to see to its own needs will not long survive. It will starve to death, or it will become dinner for some other organism. And in a very important sense, what this means is that the value of self-concern, of taking care of oneself, is built into the very circuitry itself. And I think we understand how, in a really fundamental way, the value of self-survival can actually be embodied in this very, very ancient circuitry. And all animals have that. But that, of course, is a little different from the question of how it is that some animals also care for others. And so the question has been, how is it that in the context of all of this circuitry for self-survival, how can care for others, where that sometimes involves a sacrifice to oneself, where can that possibly come from? Now, some religions will say, well, it can't come from the biology itself. It has to be imposed from without via religion. And the reason that hasn't worked out as a theoretical possibility is quite interesting. And that is that there are many cultures who don't believe in a God who is a kind of lawgiver. And yet, and this is true, for example, of millions and millions of Asians who are Confucians or who are Buddhists and so forth. So it's not that they believe that there is a divine lawgiver. Rather, they have a very different kind of approach to morality. And even though they don't have God as a lawgiver, they are, of course, as moral as anybody else. So this possibility then has made people wonder, how might we actually explain the nature of social morality as we see it in humans? But we also do see it in other primates, and maybe, and I will talk about this later, even in rodents. Now, we see social behavior in insects, in fish, as well as in mammals. But the social behavior that we see in mammals and also in birds has a kind of flexibility and a sophistication and a whole level of complexity that's really very different. So the question is, how did sociality emerge? Put morality aside for the moment. What drove, within the biological evolution of animals, what drove sociality? And one approach to thinking about this is very interesting. At some point, about 250 million years ago, warm-blooded reptiles appeared. Now, it had a great advantage because it meant they could hunt at night when everybody else was waiting for the sun to come up. It also meant that the warm-blooded animals were able to move and forage in places where the cold-blooded animals couldn't forage. The downside of being warm-blooded is that gram for gram in weight, a warm-blooded animal has to eat 10 times as much to keep the whole thing going. So this put tremendous evolutionary pressure on warm-blooded animals. As a result, over millions of years of evolution, something rather extraordinary occurred. Mammals emerged and they had fewer babies, so they might have 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 babies at a time instead of 100 and 150, as a turtle might do in laying its eggs. But a very special thing changed, and that is that the young were born very immature. What's the good of that? And the answer is a tremendous good, because the immature brain can tune itself up to the environment. And along with this, we see the development of neocortex, and that's unique to mammals and birds. And it's this highly regular 6 or 7 layer structure that overlies the more ancient neural structures, and that seems to be very immature at birth, and that is tuned up or organized to a great extent as a function of the animal's experience in the world. In mammalian brains or in human brains, we see something like 1 million synapses, connectivity between neurons, 1 million synapses made per second in the development of the infant. So what's the good of having an immature brain? And the answer is it can learn, but it too has a downside. And the downside is somebody better take care of this infant brain until it's able to be independent. Again, the evolution of the mammalian brain involves some very striking changes, the most striking of which were the changes in the very ancient structure to feelings of pain and pleasure and self-survival. So those structures then extended to the infant. It's as though my sense of myself, if I'm a mother rat, extended to my babies. So when they are hungry and cold and threatened, I feel pain. When I hear them squeal because they fall out of the nest, I feel pain. I feel pain when we're separated. I feel pleasure when we're together. So there's this very, very interesting, widespread and complex change in the circuitry of the mammalian brain that brings about what you might call altruism. That is, I sacrifice something in my own interests in order to help the other. That is, I incur a cost in order to benefit the other. But of course, in the first instance, the other is the offspring. And we know something about the neurochemicals that are involved. And oxytocin and vasopressin, which are very ancient peptides, have been put to new uses in the mammalian brain to allow for this very special bonding, where I feel pleasure and pain, pleasure to be with this baby, pain when separated. Small genetic changes then allowed for an expansion of this kind of caring through bonding. So we see that some mammals, there is very, very strong bonding between the mates. So marmosets are very small monkeys where they bond for life. California deer mice, the male and the female bond for life, and that means they stay together, they get depressed and sad when they're separated, their stress levels go up. The male helps take care of the offspring, the male guards the nest, protects the female, and so forth. And this involves some genetic change, and it involves oxytocin and its sibling peptide, vasopressin. And we think that certain other small genetic changes may then have facilitated the development of highly social mammals, mammals that like to live in groups. Now, one of the things that happens with oxytocin is that it binds to certain receptors in important parts of the brain that regulate feelings of pleasure and pain, but that also regulate stress levels. And we know that when oxytocin levels go up, that to a first approximation, stress levels go down. And so when animals have sufficient oxytocin and lots of oxytocin receptors, then in the presence of others, they're more easily able to tolerate them, and they like to be with them. And so we see the kind of heavy sociality in monkeys, in chimpanzees, in baboons, in humans. Sometimes I will observe humans in a market context, and it's wonderful to see how social they are, even with people they don't know very well, but they meet someone they haven't seen for a while, and there is this wonderful happiness and hugging about re-meeting them. So we are intensely social. So you might say, what has this all got to do with morality? And the answer is this very basic platform of circuitry and neurochemicals that facilitates and allows for bonding between mates, between parents and offspring, between individuals and friends and kin. That's caring. And that's the big change between us and, say, reptiles. So it seems that this platform then allows for caring and for feeling compassion, for feeling distress when our loved ones are injured or when they die, and so forth. Within the context of the evolution of humans, we think, of course, that early humans, Neanderthals, Homo erectus, as well as ourselves, Homo sapiens, lived in small groups. And almost certainly it was advantageous because they could share food, they could forage together, they could defend the group against predators and so forth. And so that probably also bonded them together. And very particular social practices and norms developed in those groups. And they often reflected the local ecology. So that the norms that people living on Fiji might have, given their conditions, would be quite different from the norms of individuals living above the Arctic Circle, where life is very hard, they're always facing starvation and so forth. But the platform is fundamentally the same, even though the norms and practices are different. And we also have come to realize that these norms and practices also tap into the pleasure and pain system. They also tap into the deep structures that are part of reward learning. And so children are given approval when they conform to the norms and disapproval when they don't. They hear stories about what happens to someone who violates the norms and the good things that happen to someone who stands up for others and abides by the norms. And these things actually change structures in the reward system called the basal ganglia. And so we internalize the norms and practices of our group. Now, sometimes, of course, we can see that when the norms and practices of one group differ from those of the other, there might be a clash. But probably in the early days of Homo sapiens, they were so busy trying to keep alive that they didn't worry too much about in-group and out-group. But as agriculture began to develop about 10,000 years ago, and as cities grew, and there was a division of labor, then we see a much more troubling development amongst humans, and that is a tendency to bond very, very closely with the in-group and to feel hateful towards the out-group. And to a first approximation, but I know this is not the whole story, much of the in-group, out-group conflict and hostility, I think, can be understood in a neurobiological way. Now, I hasten to add that this does not mean that neuroscience is going to tell us how to resolve moral dilemmas. I don't think that it can, at least for the very obvious reason that some of the moral dilemmas we have are dilemmas that arise only in the context of our very technologically advanced culture. So, for example, we currently have a moral dilemma about whether we can do gene editing on germ cells that would then affect not only this baby, but its babies and its babies. Can we do gene editing? We know how, but can we? Should we? This question is not a question that can come out of neuroscience, although facts will be relevant. It's a question where humans will need to get together and listen to each other, where our oxytocin levels need to go up enough so that we're not so stressed that we're intolerant of others, so that we can work together to figure out these answers. And in some cases, for some questions, there may not be a right answer. There may be better answers and worse answers, and we might have to do the best we can to converge on a good answer and then maybe modify it later and modify the modifications later. But it's a mistake, I think, to suppose that neuroscience is going to give us the answers to these moral dilemmas. Neuroscience can tell us about the platform for why we care about each other, about why it matters to us. But it can't really answer those moral questions in and of themselves. And it remains, I think, a very difficult issue to address the underlying neurobiology of conflict between groups. Aggression, we know, is extremely ancient. We can see lobsters fighting with each other. And we know that aggression is very ancient, but interestingly, it's not well studied. And so an important topic in neuroscience is to understand the neurobiology of aggression in primates like us.
I'd like to speak to you about the virtues, about good and bad in the context of science. Now, we're accustomed to thinking of virtue talk as religious only, as something you hear on Sunday or on Saturday or Friday at the church or the temple or the mosque. And then the preacher says, be good, be good. But virtues are more fundamental than just Sunday, Saturday, Friday. Virtues are essential for a society or an economy to work well. Now there's a modern conviction, a version of which comes from economics, which is that the virtue of self-interest, of prudence, of profit is enough. We in the United States say, greed is good, we say. And we think the professors of economics have told us this. And some of them do. Some of them say, oh, all that you need for an economy to work well is that people pursue profit single-mindedly. I don't care if there's slave labor or anything, we're going to pursue profit. And that's wrong, I've concluded. I once thought this was true. I was once a Marxist, and Marxism is a version of this. Then I became a Chicago School economist, and Chicago School economics is a version of this. And then finally I grew up. Finally I realized that prudence only, as you might call it, prudence being the virtue of profit making and taking care of yourself and selfishness. It's a virtue. We want people to take care of themselves. We want our children to look both ways when they cross the street. We want people to be competent. But if that's all we tell them to do, we do them and ourselves and the society a great disservice. We damage the society. There's this cynical modern view that all you need is prudence is, I believe, deeply wrong. Not just from the Sunday morning preacher's point of view, but sociologically and economically and politically. And to understand this, you have to get beyond the theories of goodness that arose in Europe in the 1700s. You have to get beyond Jeremy Bentham's utilitarianism, which says precisely that prudence is all you need, that all other virtues, love and justice and temperance and courage and hope and faith, can be reduced to self-interest. You have to go beyond that. And you even have to go beyond Kant, Immanuel Kant, the great German philosopher, who tried to reduce everything to justice alone. Justice alone. So Bentham is prudence alone, Kant is justice alone, and neither of them work. The ancient tradition in the West, and indeed in the East, in South Asia and in East Asia, is to name the virtues. Name the good ways of being a human being. Aristotle in the West is the source of this, is the beginning of this. And Aristotle says that there are 4 virtues. Courage, the chief virtue of a military society, such as the ancient Greek polis had to be because they were at war all the time. So courage, justice, namely treating other people as they should be treated, temperance, which is self-control, and then prudence. Prudence. So those are called those 4 are called in the tradition of the West the cardinal virtues: courage, justice, temperance, and prudence. 4. And then added to them what are called the theological virtues, or the Christian virtues. And it's a kind of a strange combination of the 4 and the 3 constitute, if you put them together, constitute a pretty good philosophical psychology. And the 3 theological or so-called Christian virtues are faith, hope, and love. And in the words of 1 Corinthians 13, love is the greatest of these. Faith, hope, and love. So there you are, 4 and 3. Now, these 3 now I say that they're Christian virtues. That doesn't mean, alas, that Christians are very good at practicing them. They hate as much as other people do instead of love, and they're hopeless when hope is a great virtue, and they're without character or faith as much as other people are. But still, because of the history, the accident of the history, they're called Christian or theological. Well, you would think, well, oops, now we're back to talking about Sunday morning. We're back to religion. But no, you can give these 3 virtues an entirely secular interpretation. Hope is the virtue of having a project, having a place to go, and if you don't have hope, if you're truly hopeless, then you go home this afternoon and hang yourself, right? So please don't, that's bad for you. Faith is the virtue of having an identity, being Russian or a woman or a daughter, and a reader, an educated person. So hope is forward-looking. Faith is backward-looking. It's where you come from as opposed to where you're going. And love is the great virtue of valuing, of not, there's love in the human sense. I have a dog. His name is Will Shakespeare. And I love my dog. But that's more philia, as the Greeks say, friendship, so to speak, rather than what, as the Greeks said, agape, a higher love. But in any case, those three virtues don't necessarily have to do with church or Islam or anything else. So here we have 4 and 3. Now, these, as I said, are pretty good as an account of what a flourishing human being needs. A flourishing human being can't do with prudence alone, or with justice alone. If you have not courage, you're like Oblomov, the hero in a Russian novel, and you stay in bed all day. So it turns out, if you think about it, if you think about these named virtues, behind which in all societies, including ours, there's a library of books and poems and psychological experiments, all of them tending to say, this is what a human needs, a full human life. If you think that way, then the various 1700s reductions of humans to maximizing or justice or one or the other don't work. And the danger is that you'll think these sort of boys' toys of the single virtues elevated to all virtue. That's been very bad for people. If you elevate courage and faith, where are we here? Let's see which one's faith. I think this is faith. Courage and faith, then you have, if that's all you do, then you have fascism. Courage and faith is fascism. If you elevate justice and hope, where's hope? Hope is here. Justice and hope, that's socialism. If that's all you do, justice and hope, that's an unbalanced, bad human life. And it's an unbalanced, bad human society. So what we need as humans, I don't mean that I'm saying you should need them, I'm saying we do need them, is all 7 of the virtues in some special idiosyncratic form that each of us has. I have known in my life 5 Catholic nuns well. They don't need to go into it, but I've known them well. And they, all 5 of them, were having in their own way great human lives. And I've known a couple of soldiers well. And these two men that I knew, they were having their own version of a good human life. But all these people had all 7 of these in action in some way. So the argument I'm making in all of my 3 books that I've written in the last years, in the last 10 years, the trilogy called The Bourgeois Era. In all 3 of them, I'm arguing that a modern so-called capitalist, although I don't like the word, but a modern capitalist society has to be liberal in the root sense. It has to be a society for free people, or it doesn't work well. And all 7 of these virtues need to be encouraged. You know, the scientific discovery in social science in the 1700s was that the connection between individuals and the society in terms of virtues is not one-to-one. That is, you can have a bunch of good people and have a bad society. Or you can have a bunch of bad people and have a good society. That was the discovery of Mandeville and earlier Hobbes, and it was Montesquieu and Adam Smith contributed to this. But in a way, that discovery was a mistake. Because in fact, for the good society, you can't have uniformly bad people. You can't have people who think that prudence is the only virtue. You can't indeed have people who think that hope and justice, the ideal socialist society, are the only virtues that matter. If you do that, we've discovered in the 20th century, in the sad history of the 20th century, you result in, it ends in Stalin or Hitler. And so what we need in our economy is not this harsh prudence only. In our society, not justice only. In our daily lives, we need a balance, as classical Chinese philosophy said, as classical Hindu philosophy said, as classical Greek and Roman philosophy said, we need a balance of all 7 of the virtues.
Philosophers tend to think of economic productivity as if it were a pie. One very large pie represents the economy. And so then when philosophers think of their own jobs, what is our job as people developing a theory of justice? Well, justice is the question of how to divide the pie. Now that's an interesting thing, because if you think about how to divide the pie and what would be the fair way to divide it, the only fair way to divide it would be into equal shares. Or if you say, well, people are equal, or anyway they have equal rights, and therefore if their justice is about anything, it's about people having equal shares. Now, some people nowadays, in the aftermath of 1989 and the falling of one officially egalitarian regime after another, people will say things today like, well, that equal shares theory, it's good in theory, but it doesn't work in practice. And that's not what I say. I say if it works that badly in practice, there's something wrong with it in theory too. So here's what I would say. Imagine a busy intersection where it's regulated by traffic lights. There are red lights and green lights. And if you take a snapshot of that intersection, it's a lot like the snapshot we take of the economic pie. You look at the snapshot and what do you say? You say, that's unfair. Those people have a green light, those people have a red light, and that's not equal treatment. So everybody should have a green light, and everybody should have a green light at the same time. Everybody should have a green light right now. And then you say, okay, that's fine in theory, but it doesn't work in practice. I say the reason everyone having a green light at the same time doesn't work in practice is because it's a really bad theory. It's a theory that doesn't understand what traffic lights are for. It's a thing that doesn't understand what society is for. So the snapshot is just a snapshot. It is a representation of reality. So if we come up with a theory about what's fair in the snapshot, that's not the same as coming up with a theory about what's fair in reality. That is a very bad theoretical move. What we're talking about is a theory about what is itself, in effect, a theory. The snapshot is a theory about how society looks. And it's not a good theory because that snapshot leaves out the most important fact about the situation that it is a snapshot of. It leaves out the fact that it is a picture of motion. It makes things look as if they're standing still, when in fact, that's the exact opposite of what happened. It's moving. It is important to understand that society is in motion. It is important to understand that society is a constellation, a network of evolving opportunities. It is important that almost everyone, as many people as possible, have good opportunities. In the same way, it's important that the light turns green at some point for everybody. Everybody gets to move at some point. But it's not important at all that everyone have a green light at the same time. That is not what matters. It's even counterproductive. And so that kind of equality, snapshot equality, is a spurious equality. It is not an equality that matters, morally speaking. The morality that matters, morally speaking, is the kind of morality and the kind of equality that you can see coming into place over time, as you see, okay, 18-year-olds and 40-year-olds don't have the same income. It's not important that they don't have the same income. It's probably better that they don't have the same income. In the same way, it's better that not everyone gets a green light at the same time. That it's important that the 18-year-olds have a chance to move up and get promoted and learn new skills and become experienced, valuable workers. But it takes years to do that, and it's just fine that it takes years to do that. The snapshot represents a single moment. It fails to be a good representation of what people have reason to expect from each other over time. When you theorize about how to make the snapshot fair, you're not theorizing about how to make reality fair. If you want something that works in practice, if you want real fairness, you need something that works over time. You need something that enables people to coordinate with each other over time. At a bare minimum, you need something that enables people to know what to expect from each other well enough to avoid collisions. And then in real life, you want more than that too. You want people to know what to expect from each other well enough to form contracts, to form partnerships, to form relationships, to make business deals, to be good for each other, not only to avoid colliding with each other. That is the fundamental trick, the thing about society that is a lot more complex than just traffic management. But the fundamental role for government is the simple role of managing traffic. If you turn the role of choosing people's destinations for them over to government, you get traffic jams, you get bureaucracy, you get a form of traffic management that doesn't even manage traffic. It doesn't work anymore. Serious equality is about everyone having an opportunity to make something of their own lives. Not necessarily the same thing of their own lives, but everyone has a chance to be what they can be without being bogged down by crime or by bureaucracy, for example, not being bogged down by other people choosing their destinations for them. So if you really thought that people are too stupid to choose their own destinations, it's a mystery to me why people would jump from that to the conclusion that they should be picking other people's destinations instead of their own. I don't see that. I don't think that follows at all. Serious equality is about everyone having the opportunity to choose a destination of their own without interference from the people around them as much as possible, putting people in a position where they can afford to stay out of each other's way, and just enabling them to pursue destinations of their own and to cooperate when that is mutually beneficial. You stop people from driving drunk, for example, but you don't pick people's destinations for them. Let people choose their own. Let them help each other when they can. Let them Uber. It's funny, you don't have to make it illegal not to Uber. Just leave people alone, and they will realize that their car has excess capacity, and that capacity could be usefully rented to other people. You can make other people better off by giving them rides, and it's easy for you to do, and you can make some money doing that. Let people Uber. That is the 21st century paradigm of how people develop spontaneous institutions for being of assistance to each other when you simply leave them alone.
Among moral philosophers, one school or one stream which is quite important is egalitarian. And egalitarians, just putting in the simplest way, think that there's something morally important about equality among people and something morally objectionable about inequalities among people. But if one just puts it that way, one can immediately see certain amounts of nonsense. I mean, if we look around a room at the women, we'll see that their hair is much longer than the men's. So we have an inequality. Is there anything wrong with that? Well, I mean, perhaps this reflects cultural norms which we object to, but the mere fact that some people have longer hair than others, that some people are taller than others, that some people are more athletic than others, there's nothing morally objectionable there. So if we want to talk about egalitarianism in an intelligible way, we need to be a little bit more systematic about which inequalities matter and which inequalities do not matter. Starting in the 1980s with, in particular, a very, very influential pair of essays by the philosopher Ronald Dworkin, who's now dead, which just had the title, What is Equality? There's been the view that what we should be concerned about with respect to equality is ultimately how well people's lives are going. But that's just ultimately. We shouldn't attempt directly to make people's lives equally well off for one main reason, and that reason is that we really think that people are responsible themselves for how well their lives go. Now, clearly, someone who is born in utterly destitute circumstances, is malnourished, winds up with cognitive limitations, the notion that we say that that person is responsible for their lives not going well is absurd. On the other hand, you can have two people born in very affluent circumstances, and one makes very, very bad choices and lives very badly, and the other makes good choices and lives well. And in that case, we think that that's really up to the individuals, that that there really is no objectionable inequality there. So the view came to be, and this is something that Dworkin really gave the first, well, I mean, one can trace this back to other philosophers, but Dworkin really began this literature, is saying what we need to do is we need to draw a distinction between those features of people's lives, those important features of people's lives, those features of people's lives that affect how well their lives go overall, for which people are responsible, and those features for which people are not responsible. And what we should do is equalize those aspects, those factors which contribute to people having good or bad lives for which people are not responsible. Dworkin himself interpreted that in terms of resources. And so that the way we make this division between those things that for which the person's responsible and those things for which the person is not responsible is by distinguishing those things that are resources for the person, and those are the things that people are not responsible for, and those things that people make of those resources they are responsible for. And what we want to do is equalize resources. If people have equal resources, then the egalitarian objective has been obtained. The ultimate result is there's going to be lots of inequalities, but those inequalities will be the responsibility of the individuals themselves. Now, one immediately runs into a number of technical difficulties here, because among the things that contribute to how well people's lives go are not just external resources, the nourishment that they had as a child, the housing that they lived in. There are also various internal resources. If someone is damaged in an accident and as a result can't think as well, that's not something for which they're responsible for. It's something that is internal to them, but nevertheless should be counted as a resource. And so things get immensely complicated, and there's a whole literature distinguishing different so-called currencies that we want to equalize or not equalize. My own view is that this literature really is based on a mistaken premise, that it misunderstands the relevant notion of equality that we should be concerned about. From my perspective, what we should be concerned about are the relations among individuals. What I want of a society, and I consider myself to be an egalitarian, is I want a society where no one is subservient to other people, where people don't dominate one another, where people have equal voice, where everyone, unless they've forfeited our respect by doing despicable actions, everyone is equally worthy of respect. And it's the relationships among individuals that we want to be equal. The goods, the resources they have, if they're too unequal, clearly we won't have equal relations among people, but that's not what we're concerned about. If one thinks of luck egalitarianism in a more generic way, rather than focusing exclusively on Ronald Dworkin, there were other important luck egalitarians, G.A. Cohn, Richard Arneson, in particular John Romer also. In their view, the basic view is if people are responsible for something, the state doesn't need to do anything. If people aren't responsible, then the state should equalize people's circumstances. And there's lots of problems with that. Consider people who, because of bad choices, are really, really suffering and doing miserably. This version of egalitarianism says, no problem. We're great egalitarians. We've got people who are miserable. You know, it's their own fault, and we don't need to worry about it. And from the perspective of someone who wants a society that's egalitarian in spirit, egalitarian in its relationships, that seems that seems unacceptable. It seems insufficiently egalitarian. Another objection is, suppose someone is doing really, really badly because they've devoted themselves to charitable activities to others. There was this Ebola outbreak in Africa. Individuals went to Africa risking their lives to try to help with the disease. You get someone who contracts Ebola, you go, well, it's their responsibility. They chose as egalitarians. We don't need to do anything for them. Hold on, that doesn't really seem to have captured what egalitarianism is all about. And indeed, I think that luck egalitarianism, in terms of focusing on resources or something like resources for individuals, really misses the boat. In my view, what we really should be concerned about are the relations among individuals, rather than which goods or which levels of welfare individuals have and how those compare with one another. Here's the example that Parfit gives. He says, suppose that the Earth just had two big islands on it, where there was no communication between the islands, people didn't even know of the other islands, and each of the islands was perfectly egalitarian. In terms of the relationships, in terms of the relevant goods, resources, it satisfied everything that an egalitarian want, each of the islands separately. But in one of the islands, people were living better than in the other. In the view of the luck egalitarian, unless this is something people are responsible for, which by assumption it isn't, this is morally objectionable, that there's something wrong with this divided world. In my view, if the relations among people are perfectly equal, there's nothing to object to from an egalitarian perspective. And I see there's a kind of fetishism with to what extent do people have equal resources or exactly equal opportunities, where what we really need to be concerned about is to what extent are people equal to one another in their relationships to one another.